You are listening to an American Free Press podcast.
Joining me on the line is Rick Ector from Detroit. Mr. Ector, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thank you for having me on the show. Definitely privileged to be here.
Thank you very much, sir. Would you prefer Mr. Ector, Rick, or?
Oh, Rick will definitely suffice.
Okay, Rick, thanks. I saw an article online on AmericanFreePress.net on their website. Detroit's top cop stands up for gun owners. You were featured prominently in that article written by reporter Keith Johnson. I want to get into that in great detail in a moment, but before we do, for the benefit of the listeners, can you give them a little bit of background about who you are?
Oh, perfect. Rick Ector, I run a firearms training service here in the city of Detroit. I provide preliminary training that individuals would need to satisfy if they have a desire to acquire, Michigan's concealed carry permit, we call it a CPL, a concealed pistol license. I would estimate that approximately 75% of my clientele are women, which seems to be the growing demographic in the market today for firearms training. I've been doing training for about 8 years now. It was a natural consequence of an armed robbery that I had to suffer through about 9 years ago in my own driveway as I was coming home from work one evening. That incident, however terrible it was the defining moment which forced me to take a more active role in my own personal safety. And as a consequence of that incident, I proceeded to get my own concealed carry license. And in an effort to further reduce the odds of me being victimized again, I sought out additional training, which eventually led me to the National Rifle Association. And I eventually became a certified firearms instructor and an appointed training counselor. So I truly understand what it is to be violently assaulted during a crime such as a robbery. I can basically understand the mindset and some of the emotional things that people go through in the aftermath of a robbery. And I know exactly what people are thinking. I know what their questions are, their concerns. And I feel like I'm uniquely qualified to help them. I can reach them not only, on an emotional level, but definitely provide the technical skills that they need to operate a firearm sufficiently to defend themselves, their families, and their homes. So it's a labor of love, and it's a vocation that provides me a lot of personal satisfaction.
Okay, thank you. Now, you're from Detroit, born and raised in Detroit?
Born and raised, man. 46 years old currently. I'll be 47, God willing, this upcoming September, but I think I'm staying.
All right. So I've been to Detroit. I didn't get a chance to spend much time there. I was there for a short time. I went across the border there over to Windsor for a brief time. But Detroit has a lot of, allure in the sense that there's a lot of history with Detroit. Of course, Detroit used to be one of the most elite cities in the country because of obviously the automobile industry. It's known as, the Motor City. It's also known as Motown. And now, of course, you see on the internet these images, these photos of crumbling mansions, of urban blight, of destruction. I think I even had interviewed somebody who is now taking the lots of the homes that have been torn down and turning them into urban farms.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things, very interesting time currently here in the city of Detroit. Interestingly enough, this upcoming July, we'll be celebrating our 313th birthday. And many people here, we refer to March 13th as 313 Day, which is the predominant area code for the city. And it just so happens that this year will be the 313th birthday. We've gone from a city that in its heyday and its zenith in the 1950s that had approximately 2 million people, and it was one of the largest cities in the country during that era. However, a lot of things have happened since the 50s all the way until today. But yeah, currently, our population is roughly 700,000. We're no longer in the top 10 U.S. cities population-wise. We have a lot of financial challenges. Currently, we're in the midst of a bankruptcy proceeding. We are struggling with violent crime. Some figures just off the top of my head, because I'm quoting them all the time to various people who ask. 1.92 carjackings on average per day, about 200 sexual assaults per quarter, over 300 homicides every year. Times are bad, and mince no words about that. crime is a serious issue, and we have our challenges, but, we're the city that won't quit, and people are committed to doing whatever they can to try to turn this thing around. But like I said, I'm a lifelong Detroiter. I'm not going anywhere. I'm probably going to stay here for the rest of my days. And yeah, unfortunately, we do have large tracts of the city with basically empty blocks, and if they aren't empty, there's homes on those blocks in which those remaining homes need to be turned down. And yeah, there have been some transactions in which people have bought huge parcels of those lands with the expectation that they're going to turn them into some type of urban garden or urban farm or whatever thing they're trying to do. But we have our challenges, and we're working towards it, and hopefully one day we'll right the ship. But right now, things are bad, and people are making appropriate changes to make sure they can stay safe as best they can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that police chief there, James Craig, I want to talk about him in a moment, but you mentioned that the population now is around 700,000, just to give listeners an idea of how stark the change in Detroit has been over the past several decades. It says here, at its peak population of 1.85 million in the 1950 census, Detroit was the fifth largest city in the United States, after only New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles. Amazing. Unbelievable. So you're 46, you're going to be 47, you said, if I heard you correctly. So even though you were born in the early 60s or mid-60s, you didn't see the peak, obviously, but you did probably see somewhat of the heyday of Detroit.
Well, definitely in terms of population, I recall during my adolescence, teenage years, or maybe even later, but I remember when, we were all doing everything that we could as a city to avoid dropping below 1 million, because there's, certain benefits to having a population above 1 million citizens. And I remember they were being so desperate as to try to count homeless people who were in the city, because that was something that we did not want to do. We didn't want to drop below 1 million. But we hit it, and we ascended lower than that limit, and then we're at 700,000. And, I don't know if we've seen the bottom yet with the way things are currently. Maybe with some bankruptcy filing, maybe the city can free up some money to deal with infrastructure. We got a lot of homes that need to be torn down because they're dilapidated. We have a scrapper problem where people go in and gut homes out and raid anything of material value from those homes. And, of course, they're uninhabitable. Nothing can be done with them. Maybe we can get public resources, to keep the city safe with regards to fire, EMS, and police. If we can do something with our schools and make sure the kids can get a quality education. Maybe if we can continue to develop other areas of the city instead of selected pockets in the city where things seem to be prospering, if we could spread the successes we've had in limited areas across the whole city, maybe more people would consider, moving back or coming into the city. So hopefully, we're at the bottom, but nothing is guaranteed right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're talking about hope and rising up. It's probably not a coincidence that the motto of Detroit is, and this is in Latin, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly, but Speramus meliora resurget cineribus, which means we hope for better things, it shall rise from the ashes.
Yeah, that's our motto, and it was the impetus behind the Renaissance Center, the big building downtown, which now currently serves as GM's worldwide headquarters. But the Renaissance, the Phoenix, the dragon rising from the ashes. Yeah, so hopefully our worst days are behind us. Hopefully we can resurge, and hopefully we'll see better days.
Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, you're there to train folks to protect themselves, because right now it's not good. And let's talk about, because this is something that crops up a lot when people look at Detroit, let's talk about the demographics of Detroit. Would it make sense to talk about the city of Detroit itself within the city boundaries, or the sprawl of Detroit? Or can we distinguish between them?
I think you can make some general statements about demographics, and they're changing all the time. But I would say within the city of Detroit, the most consistent numbers I've seen with regards to demographics in the city is that it's roughly 70% African American, Black. And the other 30% would be, we have a significant Hispanic population on the southwest side. We have a significant Arab population and other, white and other. So those would comprise the remaining 30%. Obviously, the outlying suburbs, they're diverse, but I would imagine that some outlying suburbs are more diverse than others. Some aren't necessarily diverse at all, but, it spans a wide spectrum. There is diversity out in the suburbs, and I guess it's increasing all the time, especially when you have, I guess, what they call black flight, when you have people in the city of Detroit who are looking to find better opportunities and better environments for their families somewhere other than in Detroit.
Okay. I guess the crime that is being talked about across the country through the mainstream media and other media is primarily in the city of Detroit, right?
Yeah, make no mistake about it. There's violent crime being done all over, southeast Michigan. It's not just in the city of Detroit. It's happening all over Metro Detroit. And, Metro Detroit is a very, very diverse, large area. Metro Detroit probably, I don't want to over-exaggerate, but definitely at least 1 million, probably 2 million people are within the region. Violent crime is pervasive everywhere. Look on the media, you'll see violent crime happening outside the city. I like to focus on the statistics within the city's boundaries, but it happens everywhere. Just the other day over in Redford, which is just outside the city's border, there was a pizza delivery man who was forced to defend himself with his gun. 2 guys approached him while they were armed, and I believe he ended up shooting one of the assailants, and the police were able to catch up with these guys when they went to the hospital. But it's bad, but make no mistake about it, it's worse in the city of Detroit.
Okay. With your business, do you concentrate on the city of Detroit or all over the place?
Well, I get my students from all over the place. I get them from the city, and I get them from the surrounding suburbs. I've been fortunate in that the way I've really approached firearms safety and personal protection. When I first got involved, in terms of taking on a more active role in my own personal safety, I'm one of those guys that when I get into something, I don't just test the waters, man. I just dive in.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
And, one of the things that I did was I created a blog. And on this blog, I would write about, my thoughts and feelings, and I would explore the legalities of carrying a gun and would talk about topics as they rose to the top of the public consciousness in the media. Currently, that blog, Legally Armed in Detroit, has over 1,600 blog posts on it, and it's been up and running for about 7 years. Uploaded 1,800 video clips that I've produced and uploaded to YouTube, and I've been fortunate in that I've been invited to appear in various media publications, both locally, regionally, and across the country. So I have a lot of exposure. People tend to find me if they're doing research on a particular subject, and if it's somehow tied to Detroit, my name seems to keep coming up. So,
right.
Yeah, just as a natural outgrowth of diving into the subject matter with fearless abandon and just doing whatever I could to learn anything that I can, it had the unexpected benefit of bringing me to the attention of people who wanted to learn more about what I do.
Yeah, it's also a catchy website, legallyarmedindetroit.com, LAID. I like that. Hey, that's a guy thing, all right? So don't hold it against us. And, of course, your other website is DetroitCCW.com.
That is correct.
The numbers of, and you said African Americans and blacks, I personally say blacks.
Well, that's what I say, too. I'm of that generation. I guess they call me Generation X, and that's what the term was then. And now some people gravitate towards African Americans. That works for me.
Yeah, it works for me because, we're all something, right? Americans, we don't know what we are. We're a bunch of stuff.
Right.
And I'm part Lebanese, I'm part Iranian, but I don't say Iranian American or Lebanese American.
Right.
I say white, even though I'm not white. I'm dark complected. So I think people get carried away with all this stuff. But let's just stick with what I like and what you like. There's a lot of blacks in the city of Detroit. Do you think this is a black issue as far as the crime goes?
I wouldn't make it a racial issue per se. I think that if you really look at some of the challenges we've had as a community, it's no different than challenges people elsewhere potentially run into. There's a lot of things that are really unique when you talk about the educational system, man. We look at the school system here, man. It's consistently not performing very well at all relative to other districts across the state and across the country. When you look at unemployment numbers, You know, you look at the disintegration of the nuclear family, the ages at which people are having offspring and having children is continually dwindling. You know, we're still dealing with the after effects of crack and being introduced into the neighborhoods, and then that generation has come of age and they're having kids. I mean, it's just a perfect storm of a lot of things. And what we're finding that we have an increasingly growing numbers of violent, youthful offenders. You know, there was the one case out of Detroit, you know, maybe 3-4 weeks ago, in which 3 children, well, I want to call them children, 3 teenagers, and even just describing them chronologically does their deeds in injustice. You know, the 3 of them, 2 14-year-olds and a 15-year-old, are committing a home invasion, you know, to a woman who's at home with her children. Who does that, you know? When I was 14, 15 years old, you know, children that young didn't do things, you know, that were so violent. It's really a nightmare.
You don't think it's a racial thing?
Well, I don't think that, you know, because of one's race that, you know, that they engage in an activity or don't engage in an activity. I think it's more or less the culture, the environment. I think if you put anybody in the environment that I just described, they probably would have similar outcomes. So I wouldn't make it a racial thing. It's more of a class, environmental, lack of opportunity, breakdown of the family thing.
Right. And for the benefit of the listeners, because this is not a video program, it's an audio, you yourself are a black man.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Sometimes, and being completely honest, it's easy to tell because black people have their own way of speaking, their own accent, their own uniqueness to them. And so many folks can tell, but not everybody can. So I just wanted to be clear.
Right.
So here we have a crumbling infrastructure, a crumbling city. Crime is on the rise. And here comes Detroit's top cop, police chief James Craig. He's from Detroit, right, originally?
Originally, right.
And he served in California, I think in Los Angeles, and he also served up in Maine.
Yeah, and he also did a stint in Cincinnati.
Cincinnati, okay. So here's a guy who has evolved over the decades. When he was out in California, I read, and this is from reading the article here and reading a lot of what you had to say. When he was in California, he didn't think folks had any rights to protect themselves, to have a concealed weapon. Then when he went up in Maine, it seemed like the residents there said, wrong, we do that here. And then he kind of evolved and he understood. And now it seems like he's doing something that I haven't seen being done by someone in his position. He's basically telling people, hey, don't call 911, protect yourself. Am I right?
Yeah, he's saying, hey, you know what, definitely call 911, but, you know, realize that we might not get there. And if the threat is here, protect yourself, defend yourself. And you know what? It makes perfect sense. It's logical. I can't think anyone who can't fathom the concept. If your life's in danger and you have the means of protecting yourself, you have a legally owned, acquired, and possessed handgun, firearm, just use it, you know, until we can get there. And it's so refreshing. It's actually funny that it's refreshing because you would think that, you know, on its face, you know, why wouldn't more law enforcement officers across the country tell us these things? But he's the 7th police chief we've had in 11 years, and he's the only one that I can recall who has dared to make such statements that citizens should defend themselves. And I think it's really due to the unique structure of how he actually was installed here. You know, normally police chiefs serve at the pleasure of the mayor. And yeah, we recently had an election in which we had a new mayor installed, but the police chief does not report to the mayor. The police chief reports to the state-appointed emergency financial manager, who is here because, you know, drum roll, the city of Detroit is in bankruptcy. So we have this guy from the state who came in, is working with the city in bankruptcy and to get us through this process, get our debts discharged, reorganized, and lay the blueprint for the city making a comeback. And they brought in James Craig as the police chief, and he does not report to the mayor. He reports to the emergency financial manager, and he does not have to deal with, I guess, typical bureaucratic-type relationships and red tape that I presume or assume that a lot of other police chiefs have to endure. And he's able to get more things done. And I presume he's able to speak his mind, and based on his unique experiences, particularly those years in Maine, you know, that could have Americans with guns is a good thing and can drive down violent crime in Texas, it is a very welcome thing to see.
Yeah, he seems like a really cool guy. Yeah, and it is surprising, and you're right. It is amazing that, wow, geez, this guy's saying this, but that's the way it should be, like you say. How far do you think he's going to be allowed to get away with what he's doing? Do you think somebody's going to come in and put a stop to it?
Well, what will be interesting is when the city comes out of bankruptcy, what happens then? If the emergency manager's gone, it's quite possible that the police chief might be gone too. But you know what? I'll say this. He is very popular right now with residents in the city of Detroit. And, anytime as a gun rights advocate, like myself, I'm enamored with the fact that he at least not only acknowledges, but actually actively, publicly supports good citizens defending themselves with lawfully owned firearms. I mean, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, and of course, when you're right, and when you think about it, like you said, we're so used to the mainstream media and the few families that control it really brainwashing us without us even knowing and dictating the way that we think. But when you think about it and you say, wait a second, the criminals are going to get a hold of the weapons. We know that. So why is it that honest, hardworking Americans can't protect themselves? And I really believe this, Rick, that the reason is because of the brainwashing done by the mainstream media. I've thought about this for very long, and that's the only thing that I can come up with as to why it is that we have become so divorced from something that should be so intuitive to us.
Yeah, it should be a no-brainer, as you said. But, even when during this current era, over the last several months in which we've had armed citizens defend themselves, defend their homes, just the language that they use to describe these events. It's taking the law into your own hands, vigilante justice, doing the job of the police.
Exactly.
Wild, Wild West was a term I heard last night. Especially when we're not talking about situations outside of the home. We're talking about honest-to-God, bona fide home invasion. This is where people who are at home, living their lives, minding their own business, and anywhere from 2 to 4 people are coming uninvited with malevolent criminal intent to invade your home and engage in who knows what activities, whether they're going to kill you, rob you, rape you, and to have the media suggest or imply that defending yourself under those circumstances is taking the law into your own hands. To me, it's just patently absurd.
Yeah, and they've been doing it for so long. Like I said, I think people are just inundated with it and inculcated and say, yeah, they're right. The media's right. After a person has come home from a hard day's work, almost everybody who, makes an honest living is struggling now to survive. Mm-hmm. And then you got these scumbags kick in your door without any concern. Like you said, whatever is on their minds, they'll rape you, they'll beat you, they'll kill you, they'll do other things, horrible things, and it's done all the time. And yeah, why shouldn't we be able to get a gun and shoot them? That's the next thing I wanted to talk about. From what I can see, Rick, it seems like this is happening now at least a couple of times a week, maybe even more. Is that right?
There has been a definite uptick in self-defense shootings. There was a time when, it's not that many years ago, I had the data not too long ago and I misplaced it, but in terms of justified homicides, last year we were down in justified homicides. The Detroit Police Department tells us that we had 15 of all of last year for 2013. Currently, year to date, from January 1st until today, we've had 10 in just this first quarter. So if you were to project that out for the year, that put us, they say about extrapolation, right? Extrapolate data at your peril. But if we took our current rate for this first quarter and just multiplied it by 4, we would be at 40. 40 would eclipse the record that we had a few years ago when we had 35. And at that time, the national media had pretty much crowned us the justified capital of the country. And, usually, perennially, Detroit's justified homicide numbers comprise the majority of justified homicides in the entire country. On the one hand, it doesn't sound so flattering, but when you take it in its proper context, that we are actually in a relatively large urban city that has a high African-American, high black concentration. However, unlike other cities, that have those characteristics, we actually are in a state which allows all citizens to get a concealed carry license. So it really doesn't surprise you because you look at states like New York and New Jersey. I mean, I'm not even sure if they let regular citizens get concealed.
No, in New Jersey, you basically have to be a retired law enforcement, or I think it used to be, I don't know anymore, but if you feel like because of your line of work, someone might follow you, let's say you're in the money business or the jewelry business, something like that. But no, it's virtually impossible in the Garden State to protect yourself.
Yeah, so when you look at it from that context, then it's perfectly understandable. It's logical to understand why Detroit would perennially lead the nation, and not only lead the nation, but actually have the majority of the justified homicide shootings in the country. On one hand, it doesn't look so flattering, but on the other hand, it's just a testament that guns carried by good Americans can actually indeed save lives, and yes, we've been in the media a lot, because these stories keep occurring, but I think it's a good thing. The powers that be, the people that we've elected to serve us in an official capacity, have not figured out what we're going to do to get violent crime eradicated. That's a huge problem. But in the meantime, I think it's great that citizens have a means to protect themselves. There are some people who will never protect themselves, and that's just a reflection of who they are and their life experiences, man. But just because this person over here is not prepared to defend their lives, their families, and their homes, and that's their right. You have a right to not defend yourself, but just don't infringe upon my right or everyone else's right to defend themselves too.
Exactly. Now, 9 years ago, like you said, you were confronted in your driveway, I guess getting home from work or something, or wherever you're at. Did you get a good look at these thugs?
Yeah, I got a pretty good look at those guys, and, in the 9 years since, I haven't seen them yet.
Were they black?
Yeah, we're black, relatively young, 19, 20s, thin, small. The only reason in my mind they were able to pull off the robbery is that they had a gun that they were prepared to use, and I didn't have one. I often quoted maxim in the gun community is that first rule to a gunfight is to actually have a gun. To me personally, having and owning and carrying a handgun for personal protection, it was beyond me. I'm not saying that I was anti-gun. I was basically ambivalent. It was one of those things that just did not matter or was not a priority. There was no perceived need to have one. I figure, hey, I'm a regular guy, family man, homeowner. I go to work, I come home, I'm not out in the streets, raising a family. What in the world do I need a gun for? That was for those other people to talk about. That was that noise or chatter in the background. And lo and behold, I became a crime victim in my own driveway. So that forced me to reevaluate my thinking on personal protection and handguns for self-defense.
Mm-hmm. Were you scared?
Oh, yeah, I was concerned, definitely, for sure. You're talking about two relatively young people. Who knows if they're scared? Even if they weren't trying to hurt you, they could hurt you by mistake. Secondly, they probably have been doing this for a while, and if they are that cold and calculated, you know what, they're probably shooting me anyway. It seems like when people are victims of armed robberies here in Detroit, the common fallacy is to just give them what they want and do what they say. But you know what, they shoot you and sometimes kill you anyway after they rob you. So you never know how the event was going to turn out. Mm-hmm. What was particularly scary about the incident was that these guys weren't content with the few things of value that I had on me. I had a wallet and credit cards, cash, cell phone, maybe even had a gold ID bracelet that they took. When you really look at the stats, that was a pretty good haul for an armed robbery. They didn't seem too pleased at the booty that they racked up, and they were actually, suggesting that we go off to an ATM machine to retrieve more money. I hadn't had a personal protection background at that time, but just common sense, that just didn't seem to be a smart thing to do.
How'd you get out of that, Rick?
I made a decision that I wasn't going to further cooperate with these guys anymore. They were saying, hey, we're going to go to the ATM machine. I looked them dead in the eye, and I said, no, I'm not going to the ATM machine. There's not that much money in the account anyway, but I'm not going with you guys. You got my card, you got my wallet, you got my car keys, you got ID. I couldn't even vote or drive a car. I mean, they got everything. Cell phone, I couldn't even call the police. And I was resolved to get shot and own that gun. for whatever reason, they didn't shoot me. They just took off. So I took that as a wake-up call, and I said, okay, you know what? I need to do something about this. But as I look back upon that decision I made, it was probably the smartest thing I did. It was rather bold not to go somewhere with somebody under threat of getting shot. But you know what? I could have been shot anyway, and then if you're going to get shot, I would rather be in my own driveway than shot and discarded somewhere on some deserted road or some empty, dilapidated block, or like we find in many cases in Detroit, they'll take you, kill you, and throw you in an abandoned house and then set the abandoned house on fire. So,
wow. Yeah,
I feel very good about the decision I made, but it just does not seem to be a wise thing to do, to get into a car with somebody and go somewhere.
No. Maybe if people believe in this, things happen for a reason. But right now, you're in a position to help people, and you've obviously dedicated your life to making sure that regular, honest, hardworking Americans are not caught in the same position that you were in. Now, you started your business about a year after this happened?
Yeah, roughly a year after it happened, yeah. Mm-hmm. I was up and running. I was motivated and on fire, man.
And how many people have you actually helped train?
That's really a hard number to pin down. I would say easily 2,000.
Wow, that's a lot. I wanted to ask you, you said you were certified, and if I go to your website here, it says that you are an NRA certified firearm instructor. What's the difference between like a regular, certified firearm instructor and an NRA certified?
In the state of Michigan, for one, the state of Michigan only recognizes two types of trainers to provide the qualifications for a concealed carry license, and that would be an individual who's been certified by some state or national level firearms education organization, which basically translates into the National Rifle Association. The other organization that Michigan recognizes would be a designated state-specified law enforcement agency, which pretty much is MCOS, Michigan Coalition of Law Enforcement Standards. So by and large, most individuals that are providing this instruction are going to be National Rifle Association certified firearms instructors. And when you say certified, that's because people who have gone through the 40-hour training, they've taken multiple examinations that had to be passed with a minimum score of 90%. They've met the standards that the NRA, the nation's largest and oldest firearms education organization in the country. I've also gone on to be appointed as a training counselor. And the difference between an appointment and certification, well, if you are admitted to the training and you pass the exams, you were then certified. Well, they don't necessarily have to appoint people. They have to like you and like what you represent and what you stand for them to appoint you to be a training counselor. So it was indeed, an honor and a privilege to serve the organization at that level.
Mm-hmm. I see here on your website that a one-day, 8-hour CCW class is $160. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Not bad.
Not bad at all. I mean, it's an 8-hour class, and one of the things that we definitely stress in the class is that we bring in a criminal defense attorney who has a specialty in firearms law, and he lectures typically at least an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours long, on everything that you're going to need with regards to the sale, transfer of ownership, transportation, carrying and possessing a firearm. We're talking about whether you're at home and what your duties and obligations are under the castle doctrine, how to be lawful, in terms of if you need to defend yourself out on the street, whether you need to stand your ground. Man, we cover everything. Different ways of carrying, concealed or open. If you're going to carry a firearm, you at least need to have a very basic, fundamental understanding of the laws that you're going to be expected to obey under a very stressful environment and set of circumstances. So I've made it my business to align myself with a very good attorney, and we've done a lot of good work working together to ensure that people know what they're supposed to know.
That's great. There are some listeners who are in the Motor City that would be interested in your course here if they have been subject to some criminal behavior as far as somebody trying to rob them or home invasion, or they're worried that it could happen and they want to be prepared. What's the best way for folks to get in touch with you?
Best way to get a hold of me is either through the internet, through the website. We've mentioned it. The website is DetroitCCW.com. My blog is legallyarmedindetroit.com. on just about every popular social media network. My frequent ID, if you look for Detroit CCW, you can find me on Blogger, you can find me on Facebook, you can find me on Instagram, you can find me on Twitter, you can find me on LinkedIn, or heavens forbid, can't remember all of that. Just Google Rick Ector, and you will find me on all those platforms, media appearances, TV appearances. Phone number, just in case. You know, we got some old school seniors that don't do the internet.
Right.
It's 313-733-7404. You really get to see that you made a difference in someone's life. They come in here looking for a solution. They're looking for answers. In some cases, they may have talked to some police officers and law enforcement. And, you know, they say, hey, what can I do? And, you know, they say, well, hey, unless, you know, something happens, you know, there's nothing we can do. Personal protection order is just a piece of paper. If you really look at it that way, a piece of paper isn't going to stop someone who's intent on hurting you. What's wrong with taking control of your personal protection? Actually, I find it empowering to know that if trouble should happen to find me, then I'm equipped to deal with it and protect myself. I can't think of any greater feeling than that.
Absolutely. I know for myself, I want to live. I mean, it's as simple as that. If it's between me and the thug's going down. Sorry.
Exactly.
Well, of course, in Jersey, you can't conceal carry, but I can make sure that in my home, I have some weapons for home defense. What's your favorite weapon for home defense, Rick?
You know, your shotgun, 12-gauge shotgun, Winchester 870, hard to beat.
A lot of folks who are familiar with this area say that even the chambering of a round in a shotgun is enough. You agree with that?
It has an unmistakable sound to it. Generally speaking, you know, if someone hears that sound, if they do not immediately vacate the premises, they have a serious disability.
Or they might be deaf, and then you're
Or they might get a serious disability.
Right. Rick Ector from Legally Armed in Detroit and DetroitCCW.com. That's Rick's Firearm Academy of Detroit in Detroit, Michigan. I want to thank you so much, Rick, for the time you spent explaining all this to the listeners. And thanks for what you're doing, because you are making a difference in a lot of people's lives. And I look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Man, I definitely enjoyed it. And if I'm ever extended another opportunity to be on the show, I will be there.
Absolutely.
Thank you so very much.